Ison lived in the language of the land, a tongue spoken in the shift of the wind and the angle of the sun. Her days were measured by the slant of light across the hard-packed earth of her yard, a slow and deliberate clock that answered to no one. Her homestead was a pocket of order carved from the sprawling indifference of the panhandle. The fence lines were straight, the barn was sound, and the horses she raised moved with a fluid grace that spoke of deep knowledge and a patient hand. She was of the NDE, the people, but her people were scattered now, ghosts on a landscape that had forgotten their names. She remained, a solitary sentinel, her roots sunk deep into the unforgiving soil. The dust was a constant companion, a fine red powder that settled on everything, a soft blanket over memory and hope. It coated the leaves of the struggling cottonwood by the well and drew faint lines on her own dark skin. She did not mind the dust. It was honest. It made no promises it could not keep. Like the silence, it was a part of her world, a world she had built for herself after the world she was born into had been taken away. She had come to this piece of land with nothing but a government paper and 2 maras of good blood. The paper was a brittle lie, a claim to something that could never be owned, but the horses were truth. They were her legacy and her future. Over the years, she had turned that truth into a life. Her horses were known across 3 counties. Men who understood horseflesh would ride out of their way to buy from the Apache woman who lived alone at the foot of the gray mesas. They came, they paid her price without haggling, and they left, speaking of her skill in low, respectful tones. The town of Providence was a day's ride east, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the endless sky. She went there 4 times a year for supplies she could not grow or make. The people of Providence watched her with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. They saw a tall woman, straight-backed and severe, whose eyes missed nothing. They called her the Indian woman or Ison, a name they pronounced with the clumsy weight of strangers. They saw her competence as a shield, her silence as a threat. They did not see the woman who spoke softly to her horses in the fading light, or the one who knew the names of every star in the vast, dark sweep of the heavens. They had their story about her, and it was enough for them. She had long ago accepted her solitude. It was a garment she had tailored to fit her perfectly. She had stopped expecting anything more from life than what she could wring from it with her own 2 hands. Love and partnership were for other people, for the women in town with their soft hands and easy smiles. Her hands were hard and calloused. Her smile was a rare and guarded thing. She believed this was her portion, and she was resigned to it. Resignation was a quiet place, a place without the sharp edges of hope. Then, on a day when the sky was the color of a faded bruise, a man rode into her yard. He was not a man she knew. He was a stranger, and strangers were a disruption to the steady rhythm of her life. He sat his horse in the center of the yard, not with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the ground he stood on, but with a quiet stillness, an attitude of waiting. His horse was a decent animal, but tired, its coat dull with the dust of a long journey. Ison had been mending a bridle on the porch of her small, sturdy house. She set her work aside, her movements unhurried. She watched the man. He was tall, but not in a way that commanded attention. He seemed to settle into his space rather than dominate it. The sun caught the dust on his hat and shoulders, making him seem for a moment like a figure conjured from the earth itself. He simply waited, letting her have the time to see him. This was unusual. Most men rode up with a shout, eager to state their business and be gone. She stood and walked down the steps. She stopped a dozen feet from him, her hands loose at her sides. She did not speak. The first word belonged to the visitor. It was the way of her people. He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He held the reins in one hand. He had a plain face, made interesting by the steadiness of his gaze. His eyes were a pale, clear gray, the color of river stones. He looked at her directly, without apology or challenge. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was low, with a rough edge to it, like unsanded wood. "My name is Elias Thorne. I've taken the old Miller place, north of here." She nodded once. She knew the Miller place. It was a hard piece of land that had broken 3 families already. It would take a man of immense will or immense foolishness to try and tame it. She waited to see which this one was. "I need horses," he said. "Good ones. I was told you have the best." "Who told you?" she asked. Her voice was rusty from disuse, but clear. "No one," he said. "I saw your animals from the ridge 2 days ago. The way they move. They have good bone and good sense. That's not something a man can put into them. It has to be there from the start." This surprised her. He had not come because of her reputation. He had come because of what he had seen with his own eyes. He had looked at her work and understood it. This was a different kind of man. She looked at him again, more closely this time. She saw the weariness in the lines around his eyes, but also a deep, unshakable calm. He was not a foolish man. "I have horses," she said. It was both a statement and an invitation. She turned and walked toward the corral, not looking back to see if he followed. She knew he would. The sound of his boots on the hard earth fell into step behind her. It was a solid, reassuring sound. The horses came to the fence as she approached, their ears pricked forward. They were not afraid. They nuzzled her hands, their soft lips searching for a treat she did not have. She spoke to them in her own tongue, a series of soft clicks and murmurs that soothed them. Elias Thorne stood back, watching. He did not crowd the animals. He gave them space, letting them get used to his presence. He understood. She pointed to a powerful-looking sorrel gelding. "He is strong, good for pulling a plow or a wagon. He has a steady mind." Then she indicated a slimmer, dark bay mare. "She is faster, smart, good for working cattle. She requires a quiet hand." Elias looked at the animals, but he also looked at her. He watched her hands as she ran them down the sorrel's leg, checking for heat. Her hands were strong and sure, the fingers long and deft. They were hands that knew work, that knew the language of muscle and bone. "Who taught you to gentle them like this?" he asked. The question was not idle. It was specific. It was about her knowledge. "My father," she said, her voice softening at the memory. "He told me a horse knows what is in your heart. If your heart is quiet, the horse will be quiet." Elias nodded, his eyes on her face. He was a wise man. It was a simple statement, but it landed in the quiet space of her life with the weight of a stone dropped into a still pool. He had not said, "Your father must have been a great warrior," or some other foolishness men sometimes said. He had understood the essence of the teaching. He had seen the wisdom in it. In that moment, a small, unfamiliar thing happened inside her. A door that had been closed for a very long time creaked open just a crack. She felt seen. Not as the Apache woman, not as a curiosity, but as a person with a skill that had been passed down to her, a skill that he recognized and respected. It was a quiet recognition, a silent exchange that passed between them in the dusty air of the corral. He stayed for an hour, looking at the horses, asking quiet, intelligent questions. He did not speak of price. He spoke of temperament, of bloodlines, of how they held up in the dry season. He was learning her, not just her animals. Finally, he settled on the bay mare. "She's the one," he said, "if you're willing to sell her." "My price is fair, but it is not low," she warned. "I expect to pay for quality," he replied, meeting her gaze. She named the price. He did not flinch. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch, counting out the money into her palm. His fingers brushed against hers, and his skin was warm and dry. She closed her hand around the coins, the metal heavy and real. As he prepared to leave, leading the mare, he paused. "The Miller place needs a lot of work. I expect I'll be needing other things. Rope, maybe some leather for repairs. Is it all right if I stop by now and then?" It was a practical question, but they both knew it was more than that. He was asking for permission to enter her world again. She thought of the long, silent days ahead. She thought of the quiet satisfaction of her work. She had believed it was enough. Now, for the first time in years, she wondered if it was. "I am here," she said. It was all the answer he needed. He nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible dip of his head. Then he mounted his horse and rode away, leading the bay mare. Ison watched him until he was just a small shape against the vast, empty canvas of the plains. The dust settled behind him, and the world was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. It was a quiet that held the echo of a man's voice, a quiet that was filled with a new and unsettling possibility. Elias Thorne became a subtle but persistent presence in the landscape of her life. He did not come calling in the formal sense. There were no flowers, no awkward parlor visits. His courtship, if it could be called that, was a thing of practicality and purpose. It was a courtship conducted in the language she understood best. The language of work, of observation, of quiet, meaningful action. A week after he bought the mare, he appeared at her fence line. She saw him from the house, a solitary figure working in the heat of the afternoon sun. He was resetting a post that had come loose, the one that marked the corner of her property and the edge of the old Miller land he now owned. He could have set a new post on his side, leaving hers to rot. Instead, he was repairing the one they shared. He worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm, his movements efficient and strong. He did not look toward her house. He was not performing. He was simply doing a job that needed to be done. She watched him for a long time from her window. She saw the way he tested the post for stability, the careful way he packed the earth around its base. He was a man who finished what he started and who did it right. When he was done, he gathered his tools, coiled his rope, and left. He did not call out to her. He did not seek her praise. The repaired fence post was his only statement. Said, "I am your neighbor. I respect the boundaries and I will maintain them." A few weeks later, he rode into her yard again. This time, he needed a length of good rope. He said his was old and had frayed. She sold him the rope, and they stood on her porch for a few minutes, speaking of the lack of rain. It was a simple conversation, the kind neighbors everywhere had. But his eyes were not on the sky. They were on her, on the way she stood, on the way her hands rested on the porch rail. He was watching her, learning her, in the same way he had watched her horses. The town of Providence noticed. Of course, it noticed. In a place where the arrival of the weekly mail wagon was a major event, the repeated journeys of the new rancher to the Apache woman's homestead were cause for considerable speculation. George Alcott, the owner of the mercantile, was the town's primary gatherer and disseminator of information. He was a decent man, but one who enjoyed the small dramas of other people's lives. When Elias came in for supplies, Alcott leaned on the counter, a knowing look on his face. "Saw you heading out west again the other day, Thorne. That's a long ride for a bit of rope." Elias did not rise to the bait. He continued checking his list. "Her rope is better than yours, George. It's braided tighter." Alcott chuckled. "I'm sure it is. But folks are starting to talk. They're saying you have an interest in more than her rope." Elias looked up then, his gray eyes flat and unreadable. "Let them talk. It passes the time for them. Just be careful is all I'm saying." Alcott pressed, lowering his voice. "She's not like other women. She's her own person. Lived out there alone for years. She's set in her ways. Proud. Some might say she's cold. Some people are fools," Elias said, his voice quiet but sharp. He paid for his goods and left the store, leaving George Alcott to stare after him. A new piece of information to add to the town's growing story. Elias Thorne was not a man to be warned off. The seasons began to turn. The relentless heat of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The wind grew a sharper edge. Elias continued to find reasons to visit Ison. He brought her a piece of petrified wood he'd found while digging a new well. He asked her advice on the best place to shelter his animals from the coming northers. Each visit was a small stone dropped into the well of her solitude, sending ripples through the still water of her life. She found herself listening for the sound of his horse. She found herself noticing the way the afternoon light fell across the track that led from his land to hers. She was unsettled by these new feelings, by this slow erosion of the walls she had so carefully built around herself. She did not know what he wanted. He never spoke a word that was not practical, never made a gesture that was not rooted in some logical need. And yet he kept coming back. The turning point came in late October. A storm blew in from the north, a furious, violent thing that threw rain against her house like handfuls of gravel. The wind shrieked for 2 days. When it finally blew itself out, the world was washed clean and broken. A large branch had fallen from the old cottonwood, and a section of her barn roof had been torn away, leaving a gaping hole open to the sky. She surveyed the damage with a grim sense of acceptance. It was work. It would be hard work, done alone, but she would do it. She had always done it. She was measuring the size of the hole, planning the repairs, when she heard the sound of a wagon. It was Elias. His wagon was loaded with fresh-cut lumber and a small barrel of nails. He pulled up and got down without a word. He looked at the roof, then at her. "The rain is coming again Thursday," he said. This corner always looked weak. He had noticed. He had been paying attention for weeks, for months. He had seen the weakness in her barn that she herself had overlooked. And he had come prepared. She did not know what to say. The words "thank you" seemed too small, too hollow for the magnitude of his action. This was not a small favor. This was lumber. This was a day of his own hard labor, given freely without being asked. It was an act of profound, practical care. "I can pay you for the wood," she said, her voice stiff. "No," he said simply. "This is what neighbors do." He took a ladder from the side of his wagon and leaned it against the barn. "I'll need your help lifting the main beams." They worked all day. They did not speak much. They did not need to. Their communication was in the shared rhythm of the hammer, in the way she anticipated the tool he would need next, in the way he held the heavy beam steady while she secured it. She watched his hands. They were capable and sure, driving each nail home with clean, efficient strokes. He did not waste movement. He did not waste words. As the sun began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the land, they finished. The new section of roof was solid and tight, stronger than it had been before. They stood on the ground, looking up at their shared work, their shoulders aching with a good and honest fatigue. "It's good work," she said. "We did good work," he corrected her gently, including her in the achievement. She turned and looked at him then. The fading light softened the hard lines of his face. The dust of the day's work was on his clothes and skin. And in his eyes, she saw a quiet, steady light that had nothing to do with the setting sun. She saw a man who was not afraid of silence, who was not afraid of work, who was not afraid of her. "Come inside," she said. "I will make us something to eat." It was not a request. It was a command, a summons. He had crossed a threshold in her world, and now she was inviting him into her home, the most private, guarded part of her life. He simply nodded and followed her up the steps. The inside of her house was as spare and orderly as the land outside. It was one room, clean and functional. A fire burned in the stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering light on the smooth wooden floors. It smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and the faint, clean scent of soap. He sat at the small wooden table while she moved about the room, preparing the meal. He watched her, his presence a quiet weight in the small space. She made a simple stew and fresh bread. They ate in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against their bowls and the crackle of the fire. The silence was not empty. It was filled with the unspoken things, with the day of shared labor, with the months of quiet observation that had led them to this moment, to this table. When they were finished, she took the bowls away and came back with 2 cups of hot, dark coffee. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around the warm cup. The firelight played over his face, making shadows dance in the hollows of his cheeks. He looked tired, but content. He broke the silence first. His voice was low, and it seemed to fill the small room. "I find reasons to ride this way, Ison." It was a confession, plain and unadorned. He was laying a truth on the table between them, a truth that was both obvious and terrifying. He was telling her that the repaired fence, the rope, the advice about the weather, it had all been a pretext. The real reason was her. She met his gaze across the table. Her heart, a thing she had thought long dormant, beat a slow, heavy rhythm in her chest. She had to know. She had to understand the depth and quality of this man's intent. She had lived her life by her own rules, and she would not abandon them now. She would not trade her hard-won solitude for a thing that was not strong enough to last. She took a slow breath, gathering her thoughts, choosing her words with the care of a hunter placing a shot. She would offer him a truth of her own, one that was harder and sharper than his. "I have thought about having a child," she began, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the quiet of the room. "To pass this land to teach the old ways, the things my father taught me. A child to remember my name when I am gone." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle between them. Elias did not move. His eyes never left her face. He was listening, truly listening. "But I will not have a weak child," she continued, her voice dropping lower, gaining intensity. "Or a foolish one. The world is too hard for that. I would need a worthy father." It was all there. A challenge. An offer. A test. She was not speaking of love or romance, not in the way the women in town spoke of it. She was speaking of something more fundamental, more elemental. She was speaking of legacy, of survival, of strength. She was telling him that if he wanted a place in her life, this was the measure he would have to meet. He would have to be worthy of her future, of her child, of her blood. The fire crackled in the hearth, a loud sound in the sudden, profound silence. She watched his face, searching for any sign of fear, or confusion, or offense. She saw none. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes, she saw not shock, but a deep and solemn understanding. He had heard what she had truly said. He had understood the terms. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table. He did not break her gaze. He nodded once, a slow, deliberate movement. "Then you'll let me prove I am," he said. It was not a question. It was not a boast. It was an acceptance, a vow. He was agreeing to be tested, to be measured by her standards. He was placing himself in her hands. A tremor went through her, a feeling so strange and powerful it almost frightened her. It was the feeling of being truly understood, of having her own fierce, practical heart recognized by another. He was not a foolish man, and he was not weak. The decision was made. The courtship would begin. Not a courtship of whispered words and stolen glances, but a trial of character, a slow and careful building of a foundation strong enough to withstand the wind, and the rain, and the long, hard years to come. The seasons that followed were a time of quiet evaluation. Elias did not change his methods. He did not bring her gifts or offer pretty words. He showed his worth in the steady, patient application of his character to the world around them. He did not ask for her time. He simply appeared and worked alongside her, their lives beginning to braid together like two strong lengths of rope. He came to help her with the autumn roundup, when she brought her horses down from the high pastures for the winter. He rode with her for 3 days, his presence a quiet and reassuring constant. He knew horses and he knew the land. He moved with a calm confidence that soothed the animals and made the difficult work easier. She watched him. She saw his patience with a young, spooked colt. She saw his endurance, riding from sunup to sundown without complaint. She saw his foresight, when he pointed to a narrow, hidden canyon that would save them half a day's ride. He was a man who saw the truth of a situation, not just its surface. One evening, as they sat by a small campfire, the horses grazing peacefully nearby, he spoke of his own past. He told her of the farm he had left behind in Ohio, a place that had been green and soft, a place that had nearly smothered him with its predictability. He had come west not for gold or glory, but for the stark, honest emptiness of the land, for a place where a man was measured only by what he could do, not by who his father was. He spoke of his own solitude, not as a burden, but as a long period of quiet that had taught him to listen. As he spoke, Ison realized he was not so different from her. He, too, had chosen a life apart, had found a kind of peace in self-sufficiency. But he had come to the end of it. He was looking for something more, something to build with another person. He was looking for a partner, not a prize. She, in turn, began to share pieces of her own world with him. She showed him which plants held medicine in their roots, and which ones could kill a man with a single leaf. She taught him how to read the clouds, to know when a storm was coming not by its sound, but by the color of the sky at dawn. She took him to a hidden spring, a place her people had used for generations, its location a secret held close to her heart. Sharing it with him was an act of profound trust, a gesture that said more than any declaration of affection could. He accepted these gifts of knowledge with a quiet reverence. He did not question her. He listened, he learned, and he remembered. He was showing her that he valued her wisdom, her heritage, the very things that the people in Providence saw as strange and alien. He saw them as a source of strength. One day they rode together to survey his land. The old Miller place was indeed a hard piece of country. It was rocky and windswept, and the house was little more than a dilapidated shack. But Elias saw its potential. He showed her where he planned to build a new barn, how he would dig a cistern to catch the runoff from the spring rains, how he would plant a windbreak of hardy trees to protect the house. He had a vision for the land, a practical, long-term plan. He was not a dreamer, he was a builder. As they stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, he turned to her. "The people in town, they have their stories about you," he said, his voice thoughtful. "They talk about you as if you're a ghost, something that doesn't quite belong here. They don't see you, Ison. They just see the story they've made up." "I know," she said. It was a fact of her life, one she had long since accepted. "They have it backwards," he said, his gray eyes serious. "You're the one who belongs here. You understand this place. You're a part of it. They're the ghosts, just passing through, leaving nothing behind but their dusty little town." His words settled deep inside her. He saw her. He saw her connection to the land not as a sign of her otherness, but as proof of her permanence. He was validating the very core of her identity. He understood that she was not just living on the land. She was the land's daughter, its keeper. This understanding was a more precious gift than anything money could buy. The town continued to watch their strange courtship. The sight of Elias Thorne and the Apache woman riding together became a familiar one. The speculation in George Alcott's store shifted from wary curiosity to a kind of grudging acceptance. They were two solitary, serious people. Perhaps it made a kind of sense that they would find each other. They were a matched set, like two halves of a rough, weathered stone. As winter settled in, the visits became less frequent but more meaningful. He would ride over during a break in the weather, bringing a quarter of venison he had shot, or she would ride to his place, bringing a loaf of her dense, dark bread. They were building a life together, one shared meal, one repaired fence, one quiet conversation at a time. They were building a foundation not on the shifting sands of passion, but on the solid rock of mutual respect and deep, practical understanding. Ison continued her evaluation. Was he honest? Yes, to a fault. Was he strong? Yes, in both body and spirit. Was he kind? His kindness was not a soft, easy thing. It was a practical, protective force like a stone wall that keeps out the wind. He had met every test she had silently set for him. He had proven himself to be a man of substance, a man who did not perform, who did not posture. He was simply, quietly himself, and that, she was beginning to realize, was more than enough. He was worthy. The realization came to her one evening as she sat alone by her fire. She thought of the child she had spoken of, the child who was the reason for this long, careful test. She could picture that child now. A child with Elias Thorne's steady gray eyes and her own knowledge of the world. A child who would be strong and smart, and who would belong to this land in a way that no one else could. The thought did not frighten her. Felt right. Felt like the future. Spring arrived, painting the drab landscape with the brief, brilliant colors of wildflowers. The air grew soft and warm. The world was waking up, and something inside Ison was waking up with it. The long winter of her solitude was ending. Elias came to her one afternoon in late April. There was a new gravity about him, a sense of purpose that was different from his usual quiet determination. He did not speak of work or weather. He asked her to walk with him. They walked to the small creek that marked the eastern edge of her property. The cottonwoods were in new leaf, their bright green a startling contrast to the red earth. The water ran clear and cold over the smooth stones. It was a peaceful place, a place of quiet beauty. They stood by the water's edge for a long time, the silence comfortable between them. Ison waited. She knew this was a moment of significance. She could feel it in the air, in the stillness of the man beside her. Finally, he turned to face her. He looked at her not as a neighbor, not as a partner in work, but as a man looks at a woman he has chosen. "I have mended my fences," he said, his voice low and steady. "And I have built my house. It is small, but it is strong. My land is ready. I am ready." He paused, and his gray eyes held hers. "I have spent this past year trying to be a man you could respect. I have tried to be worthy, Ison." He did not say he loved her. The word would have sounded strange and out of place between them. Instead, he spoke of his readiness, of his work, of his effort to meet the standard she had set. It was the most honest and profound declaration she had ever heard. She looked at him, truly seeing the man who stood before her. She saw the lines of sun and wind etched around his eyes. She saw the strength in his jaw, the quiet certainty in his posture. She looked down at his hands, calloused and capable, the hands that had repaired her roof and gentled her horses. These were the hands of a good man, a dependable man. She had set him a test, and he had passed it not by trying to impress her, but simply by being himself. He had shown her his character day after day, in 100 small, deliberate actions. "You are not a foolish man, Elias Thorne," she said, her voice soft but clear. "And you are not weak." She reached out and took his hand. Her calloused fingers intertwined with his. It was her answer. It was her yes. He did not have a ring. Such a thing would have been meaningless to her. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, smooth, dark stone. It was a river stone, worn perfectly round by years of moving water. It was a simple, beautiful thing, a piece of the land they both understood. "I found this at your secret spring," he said, placing it in her palm. It felt permanent. She closed her hand around the stone. It was cool and solid, a tangible symbol of his promise, a promise of permanence, of a future built together on the solid ground of who they were. They were married a month later, on a bright, clear day in May. The ceremony was conducted by a justice of the peace in Providence. It was a short, simple affair. The room was filled with the curious townspeople. George Alcott stood near the front, a look of sincere, if surprised, pleasure on his face. The town had come to watch the end of their story, the strange courtship of the quiet rancher and the Apache woman. Ison wore a simple dress, her dark hair in a single thick braid down her back. Elias wore a clean shirt and a look of quiet solemnity. They stood before the justice and spoke the required words, their voices clear and steady in the quiet room. But the real ceremony was not in the words they spoke. It was in the look that passed between them. It was a look of profound understanding, of shared history, of a future acknowledged and accepted. It was the look of two people who had found their way home, not to a place, but to each other. They had arrived somewhere they had always been headed, and the town, for all its gossip and speculation, had only been a witness to a journey they could never truly comprehend. They walked out of the courthouse and into the bright sunlight, husband and wife, their joined hands a quiet statement of the strong, unbreakable bond they had forged. 5 years passed. The land changed and they changed with it. The two homesteads, his and hers, were now one. The fence that had once divided them was gone, and in its place stood a new, larger house, built by Elias's own hands from stone gathered from the mesas and wood from the distant mountains. It was a house built to last, a house that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. The Thorne Ranch became a place of quiet prosperity. The herds of horses and cattle grew, their quality known throughout the territory. The name Thorne came to be associated with honesty, hard work, and an uncanny understanding of the difficult land. People no longer spoke of Ison as the Apache woman. They spoke of her as Mistress Thorn, a woman whose skill with horses was legendary and whose quiet dignity commanded a deep and abiding respect. Their life together settled into a comfortable, productive rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the needs of the land. They worked side by side, a true partnership. He was the builder, the planner, the one who saw the long view. She was the heart of the operation, the one with the intuitive knowledge of the animals, the one who understood the land's secrets. They spoke little, as always, but their communication was seamless. A shared glance across the corral, a simple nod at the dinner table. These were the threads of a conversation that had been ongoing for years. They had a child, a son, named Daniel, after her father. He was a sturdy, serious boy of 4, with his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. He was a child of both worlds, quiet and observant, at home in the saddle as he was sitting at his mother's feet, listening to the old stories in the NDE tongue. He was the future she had once only dared to imagine. He was strong and he was not foolish. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, Elias stood on the porch of their home. He watched Ison in the main corral. She was working with a new foal, a skittish, long-legged creature. She was not breaking it. She was gentling it, using the same patient, quiet methods her father had taught her. Her movements were a kind of slow, graceful dance, her voice a low murmur that seemed to be part of the evening air. Their son, Daniel, sat on the top rail of the fence, watching his mother with a rapt attention. He was utterly still, absorbing the lesson, learning the language of patience and respect that could not be taught in words. A deep sense of peace settled over Elias, a feeling of profound gratitude that was so immense it was almost a physical presence. He looked at his wife, her strong, straight back, her capable hands. He looked at his son, the living embodiment of their union, the inheritor of their legacy. He looked at the land, their land, stretching out before him, a place that had once been harsh and empty, but was now filled with the meaning and purpose of their shared life. He thought back to that first day, when he had ridden into her yard, a stranger looking for horses. He had seen something in her then, a quiet strength, an unyielding integrity that had called to a similar place deep within himself. He had not known, in those early days, that she was testing him, measuring his worth. He had only known that he had to see her again, that her presence was like finding a deep, clear spring of water in the middle of a desert. He had simply tried to be the kind of man who deserved to stand in her light. Ison finished with the foal and turned, her eyes immediately finding him on the porch. A small, rare smile touched her lips, a smile meant only for him. He raised a hand in greeting. She lifted their son down from the fence and, holding his hand, began to walk toward the house, toward him. The world was quiet. The only sounds the soft crunch of their boots on the earth and the low sigh of the wind through the eaves of the house he had built for them. It was a good life, a solid life, a life built not on grand passions or flowery promises, but on a foundation of truth, respect, and the shared language of work. He had proven himself worthy, and she had given him a world. It was more than enough. It was everything.